why does a vintage sweater feel and look different the moment you put it on? And not just look different, really feel different. I've knit a lot of vintage and modern garments over the last 2 years, and I've rocked a lot of them to finally realize the differences. And once you've seen them, you cannot unknit this knowledge. I've analyzed vintage patterns and modern patterns, and today I'm going to take you along to understand the differences in construction that have a huge impact on how it feels to wear those garments. And spoiler, it's not just about yarn or gauge. So let's sit down for a moment. And I want to start with the shoulder and sleeve construction first, because I don't think most knitters are aware how defining the placement of your shoulder seam is for the overall perception of your garment. Vintage garments are usually knit in pieces and have set-in sleeves. The point where the set-in sleeves are placed is anatomically where your arm is placed into your shoulder. And this is giving you an overall really tailored look because it's the same way sewn and tailored garments have been made. And additionally, vintage garments have little to no ease underneath your sleeve. This is defined by the length of your arm's eye and the ease at the top of your arm. Modern garments like this cumulus blouse have a lot of ease underneath your garments. They are designed for a more comfortable, oversized fashion. And you have to keep in mind today's overcoats and things we wear, they're also designed to be oversized. So we have space for this kind of ease underneath your sleeve, because this can be very comfortable, especially in the summertime when you're prone to sweat a lot. But vintage garments, also the overgarments, were overall more tailored. So you wouldn't have been able to fit this kind of excess fabric in your coat. So overall, we're having a more tailored silhouette in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s versus a more comfy and oversized silhouette in today's garment. Moves us right into the next topic of ease. And to understand that, you need to realize that vintage and modern day patterns were designed for completely different lifestyle, and not one is better than the other, they are just different. Today's fashion is dominated by ready-to-wear fashion from a lot of big brands. They're not tailored for your body, but rather made for a lot of different body shapes smooshed into one size category. And to make that happen, you need a certain amount of ease, or otherwise it would not fit enough people per size category. But back in the day, in the 1930s, 40s, or 50s, people didn't have as many garments on average. So these garments were usually still made by tailors or for smaller groups of people, or you made them yourself. And you could tailor them to your body. So these are two completely different aesthetics and lifestyles. And also keep in mind, houses weren't as insulated back in the day. And if you don't have as many garments, you need to repetitively wear your garments. So they need to hold up better. And the other big influence was people were usually also sewing their garments, and a lot of knit garments, as they were knit in pieces, are much closer to sewing patterns back in the day than they are to our today's knit and round seamless garments, which gives you a lot of more flexibility in tailoring them to your body. And I want to hold on here for a moment and really emphasize the difference these two factors already make. The tailored approach for your sleeve and shoulder placement on your individual body, the little amount of ease in your sleeve and arm's eye, and the little to no sleeve overall give you a completely different wearing experience. So you can be spot on with your gauge and knit a vintage garment as it was intended to be worn, and it still can be uncomfortable or off for you because you're just not used to wearing garments that fit like this. So you have to keep those differences in mind. Not saying, again, one is better than the other, they're just different. And as I've just mentioned, your gauge being spot on. Gauge is completely different in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s than it is today. On average, we're seeing gauges from 26 to 32 stitches per 10 centimeters, which would be 5 to 7 or even 8 stitches per inch. And that is really dense. And this is for a certain amount of reasons. One is the denser the fabric, the more it behaves like fabric for sewing. Second, the tighter you gauge, the better the warmth insulation. We already had the different lifestyles, and it would drape, as you can see in this video. So vintage tailored garments, they weren't designed to be drapey. That just wasn't the fashion. The fashion, or the idea, was to have a defined waist, defined shoulders, and depending on the decade, more narrow or wider shoulders, but everything was really defined on your body with little ease. And the denser the fabric, the easier it is to get that overall look. Modern fashion is more about drape, and how many garments of garments use mohair because it is so drapey, or alpaca or silk, because that is simply the aesthetic and the fashion of the day. And also, the bigger gauge you have, the quicker the garment is knit. And let's be real here for a moment. I see so many videos on Instagram. How fast can I knit this or that? How many garments can I make? We're all prone to fast fashion. It's just an influence we're under. And I'm not saying I'm any different. I love a good challenge, and I like to knit against the watch, even though I know this is meant to be a relaxing hobby. But this is just something that is in our brains because this is the world we're living in. And a garment with 30 stitches to 10 centimeters or 7 stitches per inch just takes so much longer to make than a garment with a 20 stitch gauge. That just is the biggest difference. That just is a really big difference, again, in the way we're living today versus back then. We also have far more garments than we had back then. We're not used to making 1 or 2 or 3 really good fitting garments a year. That is not the way our dopamine levels work these days. We're influenced by so much social media with trends, with special pieces. It's just oftentimes not feasible with the life we have today. And I've mentioned the tailoring aspect of the garments and behaving like sewing patterns quite a lot. And I want to go into that for a moment because you might be wondering what that actually means, especially if you're not having a sewing background. So with sewing patterns, big companies and small companies, they even ready to wear and sewing patterns, they usually have blocks. They fit certain measurements into one category, and they make a basic block. This is the starting point for all of their designs, and they vary in the amount of ease they're putting in compared to your measurements, and that could be in width or in length. That is why some garments from companies fit you better than others, because they have different blocks. That is what a knitting block looks like. It's the same as a sewing block looks like for the front or the back. It just has less ease because knitting fabric is just more elastic. And what this does is it's taking measurements from your 3D body and putting it into 2D. In sewing, you would now put this on fabric, cut the fabric, and seam it together. And then you would have your garment. And vintage patterns that are knit in pieces are no different. You would knit the front and the back flat and the sleeves flat. You would seam them together and then seam in the sleeves into your garment. And that is what I mean with their behaving like sewing patterns. And then gives you certain advantages and disadvantages. You know, you have to seam in your garments. You have to knit them flat. And I know not everybody loves purling. Your gauge can be very different from knitting in the round and knitting flat. If you have to combine that, you need to figure out your gauge differently. But you have a lot of advantages if you're looking for a more tailored look. You are more flexible in deciding, your increases and decreases, your shaping for your bust, for your back. You're just more flexible to put in your own measurements into garments and have individual pattern blocks, individual sizing from bust to chest. Usually the measurement we have at the bust is our widest point for females, and then the chest is considerably smaller, and the chest measurement is usually smaller than the back measurement. And your garments will just fit easier. You have more movement in the sleeves if the back is slightly wider, if your back is wider. I already mentioned my stupidly narrow shoulders. That is so much easier to incorporate into that pattern as it would be for a garment that is knit in the round. Same goes for, we're using a lot of short rows to allow for our backs to be longer, just anatomically, but they can be visible. You do not have that problem if you're knitting front and back separately. And that also has impact in the way your sleeves are shaped. Sewing garments usually have a front and a back point where the sleeves are sewn in because our back is longer than our front, just the way our body is shaped. So in the patterns I usually use and the patterns I write up for my body, my back rise is 2 centimeters longer than my front. That is what I usually add in for short rows. And that is what I just knit my back pieces longer than my front. And that just makes for a more comfortable and natural look for my body. So you have far more freedom in your design choices than you have if you're going for a more comfortable, maybe knitting experience. Everything has its trade-offs. But that is meant with the sewing aspect of vintage knitting patterns. So that was a lot of information on vintage knitting patterns. And I know they are not for everyone because they have limited information usually in the knitting patterns. And tailoring your garments takes knowing your body and a little bit more experience. And it takes a lot more time with a denser gauge and the sewing them together. But the garments you have, in my personal opinion, for this aesthetic, there's just so much better than an oversized garment. It just looks more dressed, it looks more polished, and you're investing so much time in knitting another sweater as well. It's not that much more time, and you can learn all those things very easily and get this beautiful aesthetic. And I want to help you do that without wasting 2 years of your time just like I had. But if you're not ready to move into the vintage knitting world yet, there are modern designers that are taking a more tailored approach that is probably not intentional vintage, but it's taking more of the vintage aesthetic and tailoring aspect into the modern world. It might be a good starting point. For those of you who've seen my past videos, I've been really obsessed with Sari Nordlund's patterns, and I didn't really understand why until I analyzed the knitting patterns. Her arm's eye depth is more similar to vintage patterns than to modern patterns. She's generally overall in the patterns that I've made, which is the Rococo raglan and the Laolo V-neck top with less ease, which is also giving them a more vintage approach and is easier to combine in a modern vintage wardrobe. So I would highly recommend her patterns. And then there is Rebecca Clove from the Crea Bear, and I've knit the first sweater. And even though I'm not wearing it because the gauge was too bulky and I don't like the aesthetic on me, I love the construction. It is a more tailored approach. She's trying to make these garments accessible for everyone and everybody. And I love that. And I'm definitely going to knit more of her garments in smaller gauges because I really love the tailoring aspect. So these would, in my personal opinion, be really good starting points. There are more instructions. It's a modern way of knitting, but it's leaning towards vintage if you want to dabble your fingers in there. But as I've said before, I would love for real vintage patterns to be more accessible for everyone. So this is the starting point of a series. So if you don't want to miss out on any of the upcoming videos, you know the drill, like and subscribe. But the aim of this channel is to get you into the real vintage world and make it work for your body. And I want to push away a few of the blocking stones. So in the next video, I'm going to take you along as I knit a vintage cardigan to the pattern. I'm going to adjust, obviously, the measurements a little bit for my body, but we're going to follow the instructions step by step, and I'm going to take you along with me so you might get a better understanding what certain phrases in vintage patterns mean and how to translate them to today's knitting terms. So I hope I'll see you with the next video. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments down below. Were you surprised by any of these observations I made? Do you agree? Do you disagree? I would love to have a conversation with you about this because this is not something set in stone. This is my observations and my personal opinion, and I would love to hear yours. And I'll see you with the next one. Bye!